Good afternoon again. We're happy to have with us our record holder in terms of guest appearances at the briefing, John Ging, who's just come back from the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the Central African Republic. So, John, welcome, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I have the opportunity to update you on my mission of the last week between both the Democratic Republic of Congo and Central African Republic. These two countries, of course, are countries that have been in humanitarian crisis for many, many years. But I think what is very important to communicate to you today is that they are not static crises. They are crises that are fast moving. And sadly, they are both deteriorating. In the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the numbers are quite staggering. We have 7.3 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. 5.9 million of those are severely food insecure. And when we look then into more detail, we see that 1.9 million children are severely acutely malnourished. That's 12% of the entire global caseload in one country. There are 3.7 million people internally displaced, and that's reflecting the ongoing violence and the turmoil that generates. And in that, what we have seen since August last year in the Kasai region, which is historically a peaceful region that has not been caught up in the violence of the last decade, 1.3 million people have been displaced in that region alone. So it's a very volatile situation, which is creating massive humanitarian need, principally arising from displacement. And the displacement is not just confined within the country, but also into the neighbouring countries, with 476,000 people having fled the country in the neighbouring countries and now refugees, depending on, again, international humanitarian assistance in those countries as well. The DRC is a country that has very weak infrastructure, and there is a very high reliance on international humanitarian work in particularly the healthcare sector. So that is not just linked to providing health services to those that are displaced, but also the wider community. Now, I think the key messages that really came through for me in my mission were around the displacement and the nature of the violence, the ferocity of the violence. I did visit Goma in the North Kivus. Again, what struck me there was the proliferation of armed groups and the level of banditry that is being inflicted on the population. It's a very difficult and dangerous place to work for humanitarian workers, but I have to salute their courage and also their creativity, because although the map of access looks very bleak in terms of the places that are safe to enter, I was going through the documents and I was able to see that the World Food Programme, for example, delivers 72% of their assistance into those red areas, the areas that are in conflict, difficult, dangerous to reach, which goes to show just how committed our humanitarians are in their endeavour to save lives, but how much risk they have to take as the situation deteriorates. I also visited Kananga in the Kasai region and Kaleme in Tanganyika. I visited the internally displaced, and I was obviously moved, shocked, in fact, by the first-hand accounts that people gave me of what they have gone through, the trauma that they have experienced, the scale of the loss of life, the scale of the brutality of the violence. I mean, truly very, very shocking. So behind those huge numbers are personal trauma and tragedy for each and every one of those people. The other thing that I would like to highlight to you is that I met with the government, with the Minister of Humanitarian Affairs. He's relatively new to the post, and he did really come across as an individual of a lot of commitment and conviction and ability as well. And I have to say, at that level, we have to acknowledge that the government has also been quite effective. In fact, they've been very effective in dealing with the Ebola outbreak. So while we see a lot of difficulty, and we also know, and I'm not going to stray into that area, but there is also an overarching political instability that is bedeviling the DRC right now. That we shouldn't have a narrative of hopelessness or walk away from this crisis, even though it is fast moving in a negative direction. There are obviously elements there within, including within the national capacity, that if supported can be very effective. And I do point to the personal leadership of the Minister of Health as well in dealing with the recent Ebola outbreak. But this crisis does very much fall on the shoulders of the international community when it comes to resourcing. And again, as alarming and as massive as the scale of the crisis is, sadly and unacceptably, we are not seeing anything like the level of funding for such a crisis. It is we have a humanitarian response plan for $812 million, and that is less than 20% funded. By global standards, that is way below the average. The average globally is closer to 50% annually, and this is not meeting even that poor global standard. So we have seen a recent flash appeal. That's an urgent additional appeal for $64.5 million for the Kasais, again to try and deal with this massive displacement, over 800,000 people, as I said, being displaced. We were targeting 700,000 of those for assistance, and that appeal is only 8% funded so far. So there has not been the mobilization of a funding response in line with the rapid scale of the escalation of the humanitarian need. It is just not keeping pace with that. And we really need to see our member states stepping up because, again, by any measure, this is a place where people are suffering the most appalling human tragedy. Then moving across the border to the Central African Republic, the message here is a mixed message. It's a message on the one hand, certainly for myself since I last visited 6 months ago, of some significant progress in some areas, but overarching message has to be one of real concern, alarm in fact, because once again what we're seeing in the Central African Republic is an escalation of violence, a proliferation of violence, which is now affecting a majority of the territory of the Central African Republic. Previously, we did have a situation where you had hotspots of violence, but now, as I say, there's been a much greater proliferation of violence, and as a result of that, of course, the resulting killing, injuring, and displacement of large numbers of people. Now, on the numbers, 2.3 million people in the Central African Republic are in need of international humanitarian assistance. That's half the population. They're predominantly food insecure, and 600,000 severely food insecure. Over half a million of the population, that's a fifth of the population, have been displaced. And since May this year, just last month, there's been 100,000 additional displacements. There are over 500,000 Central Africans in the neighbouring countries as refugees in Cameroon, Chad, and the DRC. We must also remember that from the last round of violence 2 years ago, you still have enclaves of minorities, which are about 36,000 people in 9 of these enclave locations, who, when violence breaks out, are the most vulnerable and the ones that we are obviously very, very concerned about their plight. Similar to the DRC, this country has very weak infrastructure. In fact, it's probably got the poorest infrastructure in the world when it comes to things like healthcare, health services, education, and so forth. And there's a huge reliance on humanitarian organizations to deliver basic health services. 50% of the basic healthcare in Central Africa is actually delivered by international humanitarian organizations, principally by the MSF and the ICRC, but not alone, but principally by them. And it's just a massive operation that they have to mount. When there, I visited Bria, which is one of the locations that has been most recently affected by clashes, armed violence, and 40,000 people have been displaced in the last month in Bria alone. And we really, again, felt in our interaction with the population, we felt the trauma of what they're experiencing, and particularly as Bria and also the other large population centre in that region, Bangazoa. These were places that had held up in the last round of conflict and were not affected, and where you had a very multi-ethnic, multicultural engagement and integration, and where, again, when I met with the community leaders, they really very, very worried that now the violence is visiting their area, and very, very difficult to control. But a lot of courage and bravery by those community leaders who just do not want to see again this inter-ethnic, inter-religious violence inflaming the entire population. Similar to the Democratic Republic of Congo, a very impressed and very impressive international humanitarian aid effort, led, of course, by those who are responding to the displaced with vital food assistance, health services for the children and affected populations. Also, a big drive to provide clean drinking water to the displaced, and as I said, an impressive mobilization of humanitarian effort by the organizations present in Central African Republic. But they also raised to me that once again the funding is falling way short. There's the 2017 appeal for $399 million US dollars is only 30% funded, and again that funding, that underfunding, is in a context of a fast-moving, fast deteriorating situation, where when people are displaced in the tens of thousands, they have nothing. They flee basically without any means to sustain themselves or have shelter and so forth. So, you know, you have to be able to respond quickly in such circumstances. Otherwise, people die or suffer needlessly. And again, the call from my humanitarian colleagues was very much to appeal for an urgent scale-up on the part of our donors. And it's you know, on this funding issue, when you look at who are the principal donors, the top donors in the top two donors in both countries, United States number one, European Union number two. In the case of Central African Republic, we have Germany number 3 and Canada number 4, and in the case of DRC, Sweden number 3. The donor base is just too narrow. On the positive side of the Central African Republic, I saw a lot of progress in Bangui. So you will all have many times been briefed about the displacement camp at the airport in Boko camp. That is now closed, and the population have basically returned to their previous areas. And I see a lot of intercommunal cooperation. So I visited also PK5, which again was a place that experienced a lot of violence, a Muslim majority area. And you again could see the wisdom, courage, leadership of the imam with his counterparts in the Christian community, really taking positive effect in joint projects, youth employment, rebuilding, and so forth. Very impressive to see the progress that has been made from a situation that, you know, at one point was akin to ethnic cleansing, such was the ferocity and brutality of the violence that people had experienced. But the resilience of community, the courage of community, the desire of communities to get back to a better life, a better future, is witnessed in how people have returned, how the activities across communities are being conducted, how the mutual benefit of commercial activity is now visible there. So you can see the progress, but then you can also feel the vulnerability when one thinks about what's happening elsewhere in the country and the violence that is erupting that could at any stage, you know, again reach the capital. So one has to really also hope that the security situation can be stabilized, because again everything begins with either the stabilization of the security situation or the deterioration of the security situation, because that is what is driving the situation on the ground. I met with the government, I met with the president, I met with the foreign minister, the minister of planning, and again these are the recently elected government, sincere people, very clear coming across. They don't have very much power because they don't have very much resources, but they are the legitimately elected government now. This is a democracy. They have been elected, and again, if I was to give you my feedback, it would be that I feel that they've got a clear vision. They don't have very much means. They need international support, but I heard them always talking about the people, rather than the government, and that, for me, was you know, again, very encouraging. I was also there on the day when Central African Republic beat Rwanda in the Africa Cup's football game, and you know, kind of remind you, first and foremost, the international team could come to Bangui safely, play a football game, and the host. This country hasn't, you know, a lot going for it in some respects in terms of the situation, but there was a little moment of celebration and and unity. You see, this is the thing. You see, everybody is cheering and happy and wrapping themselves in the 5 colours of the flag and so forth. And, you know, that's, again, given us that little insight to the potential. It's a large country, rich in resources, relatively small population, and yet at the bottom end of the Human Development Index because of conflict. So we have to really step up. And you've heard me here in this briefing many times before, reject the narrative that we can't afford to help people in these circumstances. When I was there, I heard again from too many representatives of member states, both in the DRC and in Central African Republic, that, you know, there's a limited fund, there's a limited pool of money for humanitarian action. Firstly, I have to thank those who give us money, right? So thank you for that. Secondly, I have to, on behalf of the people who depend on us internationally, living up to our international responsibility, I have to reject the statement that we can't afford to help people with basic food, medical care, shelter, water, sanitation, therapeutic feeding for starving children. I reject that in this world of ours today. And I also was disappointed, but I'm going to turn that disappointment into an appeal. The disappointment was that the President of the European Commission, Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker, issued a statement when I was there appealing to the member states of the European Union to increase their defence expenditure from 1.3% upwards. Right? He issued a press statement on that. I would have hoped that he would also have issued in that statement an appeal to the members of the European Union to increase their overseas development aid to the level of their stated responsibility of 0.07%. There are only 5 countries in the world that meet that target, set by themselves, not by us, by themselves. And they are all less one within the European Union: Luxembourg, Denmark, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. Norway is the other country that meets that target. So as anyone calls for an increase in funding the war machinery, they must, in my view, at least call for an increase in the funding of humanitarian assistance, at least to the level that has been committed to by all of our member states in the framework of financing the Sustainable Development Goals. Because otherwise, we are definitely not going to meet our target of leaving nobody behind in these 2 countries alone by 2030. It has to be funded. And for relatively limited amounts of money, we will see phenomenal impact, starting first and foremost with the saving of lives of the innocent victims in all of this, and also giving them some dignity and protection in their current plight. But if you can get to 1.3% as an average defence expenditure in the European Union, surely we can get to the 0.7% on the humanitarian side before we start going up further on the spending on the military. So again, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take your questions.
Thank you, John. Edie?
Thank you, John. 2 questions. First, as a follow-up to this whole issue of funding for humanitarian emergencies. How does the funding appeals for these 2 major crises in Africa compare with other major crises like Yemen, Syria, etc.? And are you seeing this whole issue of donor fatigue? You yourself said that the number of donors was too narrow. And could you explain again the difference between being in need of assistance and being food insecure and severely food insecure? Thank you.
Thank you.
And I forgot to say thank you for doing this on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association.
Thank you. On the comparison, these countries, the two of these countries, would be running on average, relatively speaking, 10 to 20% behind some of the more high-profile crises in the funding that they've been able to generate, relatively speaking. So when we talk about the ones that have higher political attention, like Syria, like Iraq, like Yemen, these two would be far behind those. And that's why I'm saying we have to make sure also that there is an equity. All human beings are equal wherever they might be, and we need to make sure particularly that there is an equitable distribution of available resources. On the second issue, which is donor fatigue, again, I have to say first and foremost that the few donors, the limited number of donors, the 15 to 20 countries that are consistently with us in humanitarian action across the world, they're not fatigued. They're just basically telling us they don't have more money. They are giving us additional funding, but the crises are growing, and we're not able to keep pace with those crises. So my appeal on two fronts is, one, to the rich countries. I mean, we have to, if we're looking for billions of dollars, we have to address ourselves to the rich countries. So the G7 and the G20. And only one G7 member gives 0.7%. That's the UK, right? So the message then to the other G7 members is, why? And then we have to go to the G20. As I said, there are a few members of the G20 who are, but the others are not. So this is their, they have made this commitment. They have made this commitment. Heads of state have come here, as you all witnessed, and stood at the podium of the General Assembly and proclaimed commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, but now we have to implement. So we need funding across the board. Usually, humanitarian is between 10 and 15% of the entire package. Were we to have member states across the board living up to their commitment to overseas development aid, as they have stated, then we would be fully funded. We would be fully funded. And I think that has to be debated and discussed. And I'm further adding into that debate and the discussion why, in the debate and discussion about increasing defence expenditure, which is multiple times bigger than humanitarian or development expenditure, why we wouldn't have that debate altogether. Because for those who claim that there isn't additional funding, then we would have to hope that when they're considering additional funding for other activities, such as in the defence side, that they would also take into and factor into account any available monies that should also be allocated to our side of international action. So, again, really hoping that we can get out of this, circular discussion that's going nowhere, that is simply hand-wringing on the fact that we're too poor to help those who are being killed, maimed, injured, starving, displaced, needing nothing more than the most basic humanitarian assistance. Surely we have the humanity in our wealth to find the way to actually make these allocations that are required. And this is the result, of course, ultimately, in most of these places, of political failure, which, again, falls on the shoulders of international community to be more effective in its political work as well, to prevent, but also to resolve, to support the resolution of these conflicts. But bottom line, in the meantime, the victims have to be the focus. We have to be people-centric, and we have to find the resources across this planet to do much better on meeting humanitarian assistance. And what I will also say is, we have on the front line in all of these places incredibly courageous and dedicated international and national humanitarian staff who are risking their lives and losing their lives in delivering the vital assistance that is required. So we should also be inspired and motivated also by their efforts and their commitment and their courage to do what they're doing, and then to find themselves without the resources is incredibly frustrating. Finally, on your question on the difference between food insecure and severely food insecure means that you struggle to meet your basic daily food requirements. Severely food insecure means you're not meeting them. You are dependent on international assistance. Without international assistance, you won't be able to cope. So again, we have a vulnerable population that need our irregular assistance, and we have a dependent population that are dependent on our assistance.
Joe?
I have two questions. The first one, the ODA assistance, what percentage of that approximately would go to pure humanitarian relief versus more general development assistance? Secondly, you know that 4 countries in particular have been singled out at a very high profile by the Secretary General as being in or very near famine condition. And I don't know whether you've visited all 4 countries, and you painted a rather dire picture, particularly in terms of malnutrition of children and severe food insecurity in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Could you compare the situations in those 4 countries to the 2 that you've talked about? Because those 4 are getting significantly higher profile. I don't know to what extent the requested donations or contributions have come in, but that might be drawing some funding in terms of the way it was presented as being very urgent. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Normally, on average, the percentage of overseas development aid assigned to humanitarian action is between 10 and 15%, and the balance goes to development. That's normally the breakdown. In terms of how to compare the 4 countries affected or in peril of famine, that's South Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, and northeast Nigeria. You have 20 million people in those countries that are in the affected areas. In these 2 countries, you have 10 million between the 2. So there's a comparison there, just in terms of the scale that we have mobilized globally, very high level international response to the famine, and again, hugely appreciating the collective effort, excuse me, on that. And now we're just going to have to also turn our attention to these crises as well at the same time, because, as I said, the number of internally displaced in the DRC, for example, is the highest in Africa at 3.7 million. The pace of displacement in both countries is alarming. So again, that's why we're really appealing for attention on the 2 of these. Thank you.
Other than the difference in numbers, I understand that, but as you said, every human being deserves a basic rights and humanitarian relief. Would you say that on a per capita basis, that the level of food insecurity, malnutrition of children, and I'm particularly thinking of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, because you had mentioned that, on a per capita individual basis, is it as severe as the situation on a per capita individual basis in those 4 countries? In other words, just the level of suffering, apart from, I understand, the difference in overall numbers.
Absolutely. That is a clear message. And in particular, when it comes to malnutrition, particularly in the DRC, the level of malnutrition is, by any measure, at the highest levels globally, by any measure. Thank you.
Matthew?
For UN Coalition for Access, thanks, as always, for doing these briefings. I wanted to ask you, in the DRC, I think I may have misheard you, but that you visited this Tanganyika in Haute-Wele. I want to ask you about the Lord's Resistance Army. There's a report today that they are back and took some 61 civilians hostage in the town that I just named. But in any case, during your trip, is that your understanding that now with the military effort to try to find them, going back, that are they back? Is this what impact could that have on the humanitarian situation in the DRC and the region? And also, I wanted to, you did mention Cameroon, that I did hear you say clearly, and I know that there's a lot of CAR refugees there. There was a troubling story in The Guardian recently about a program for briquettes in a camp called Mbile, which they said is going to stop being funded in June. The program is requiring 4 months of evaluation and review, and so basically people are going to have to start walking 5 hours to get firewood. And I just wondered, are you aware of that program? Is this a particularly underfunded crisis zone? What is the situation of these refugees in eastern Cameroon? We asked to speak to Mr. Lansani Fall, but it hasn't yet been possible. But maybe you can illuminate it.
Okay, so on the LRA, I mean, we all know from our past experience the havoc that was wreaked by that group. It wasn't addressed to me. I think that's a report from today. It was not addressed. It was not addressed to me in either DRC or Central African Republic, because you know that in part of Central African Republic that has been a problem as well. So I don't have any new information on that. In the case of the programs in the refugee camps in the neighbouring countries, this is part of our global appeal, and that's why, you know, I've been very focused in this briefing on 2 points. One is trying to communicate the pace and scale and ferocity of the deterioration in the humanitarian situation in both of these countries, driven by conflict. So that's the first message. The second message is that we are not seeing anything like the scale or pace of funding response for either the response inside the countries or in the neighbouring countries. And both ourselves at OCHA and our colleagues at UNHCR have been really working very hard to try and raise the alarm among our donors about how fast-moving and how fast-paced this crisis is, but also how inadequate the funding resources are. And inevitably, if you don't get the funding, then 2 things happen. You can't continue with your current programs, and secondly, you can't respond to the new needs. Now, I personally witnessed in Bria, in Central African Republic, firsthand, the shortfall between the needs of the people and what we were able to provide for them, because they just simply didn't have the money for basic things like plastic sheeting, the building of latrines, the provision of clean drinking water, the provision of food assistance, and basic medicines. It was falling way short of the needs of 40,000 people in that physical location. I didn't get to visit Cameroon, but I'm sure I would find the very same thing there, that the result of underfunding is that programs are inadequate or being closed down. And it's incredibly frustrating also for our humanitarian colleagues who in all of these places are out there risking their lives and held back only because they don't have the funding needed. On the other hand, you can really see the positive effect of where we have resources, how they're being used, and the impact that they're having. So again, while I saw the gaps in Bria, I also saw the positive impact for those who did get assistance, and I also saw the progress that has been made in Bangui in a very real and visible way. In a period of 6 months between having been there 6 months ago and being there now, I could see and witness and physically see the progress. So again, you know, two things. One is we most definitely can do better in our collective humanity to be more responsible. I don't want to use the word generous because it's responsible. We have a responsibility. We've made international commitments. We've got to step up to that responsibility. And secondly, you can actually see the value, the impact when you have the resources, which is very tangible and of course very visible that communities can then somehow cope with what is otherwise an incredibly difficult circumstance. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay. I just want to go back to your questioning of the increase in defense spending or military spending vis-a-vis the lack of sufficient response on the humanitarian side. And I just want to explore with you whether they're always mutually exclusive, because you mentioned several times that conflicts are a prime cause of the humanitarian disasters that we're witnessing. And as you know, for example, in Syria and Libya and other parts in the Middle East, you have ISIS and other terrorist groups that are exacerbating that situation. To fight them may require additional military resources. So do you see these two streams, if you will, to try to get to a more stable situation as sometimes potentially reinforcing each other or always at odds with each other in terms of objectives?
So my point here is that as a humanitarian official, witnessing the effect on real people of the inadequate resourcing that's available for humanitarian action, which is a global responsibility, clearly set out in commitments made by our member states, I am too often told that there's no more money available. And that is then linked back to the impoverished taxpayer. Right? What I'm saying is that when I read a press release that is calling for more money for defence expenditure in one block of our member states, I'm disappointed that in the same call, the President of the European Commission did not at the same time call for an increase in the expenditure of assistance aid, overseas development aid, in line with international commitments. Because addressing back to the taxpayers that more money is going to have to be found for defence expenditure should also be addressing at the same time to the taxpayers the urgent need to find more money for overseas development aid. I am not going to question the level of defence expenditure, it's not my job, but I am wanting our voice to be communicated to the taxpayers in member states that whatever the arguments might be on the defence side, and they're not doing too badly at 1.3%, because we're way behind on that level of funding, that there is also a responsibility to the people who are dying needlessly because we claim we can't afford to keep them alive. So I would like the whole effort of international expenditure to be taken out of comparing what we got last year with the year before on the humanitarian side. It was inadequate. It was inadequate the year before, and the year before that, and the year before that. You know that there's 580,000 children under the age of 5 across the Sahel died last year from preventable disease, hunger, and the effects of our inability to mobilize very meager support to keep those children alive. Are we that impoverished in the world that we're not able to do that? I'm being told on a daily basis, yes. I don't believe it. I don't believe that the world is so poor that it cannot allocate $22 billion from the global GDP to humanitarian action. I don't believe that. I really don't. There are 5 countries in the world, only 5, that have actually delivered on their stated commitment on the globally stated commitment of 0.7% of GNI for overseas development aid. I'm saying very clearly, if just the rich countries, the richest countries, the G20, if they were to step up to their commitment to overseas development aid, we on the humanitarian side will be fully funded. So that's my message, and I will continue to appeal for a debate wherever it would be useful to move past the fact that the response we get is the rich countries are too poor to provide the resources for these basic humanitarian appeals. Because humanitarian appeal is a very basic appeal for just the most modest life-saving support. And I do believe that this rich world has the resources capable to meet that demand. Thank you.
On that note, thank you, John. Thank you.